I'll just at the start here, I'll share my screen in a sec. I'll notice that, or I should note at the start that my research is on Heracles' association with Dionysus on the whole, but I'm really just talking about Heracles today. That said, in the background of what I'm talking about today is that association, and a number of the passages that I'm going to be looking at as case studies today, I'm actually thinking about Heracles and Dionysus in those passages, even if I'll just talk about Heracles for today. That'll probably be especially obvious with the first passage. So I'll now just set up my screen sharing. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen. And I'll turn off my video while I do this. And we'll proceed. So, since I'm here today to present some of my current research for the New Directions in Classics series, I'd like to begin with something that we might call both new and old. So the slide I'm about to show you contains an excerpt from the work of the philosopher Damascius. Damascius was the last head of the Platonic Academy until it was closed in 529. As such, he is one of the philosophers sometimes called a Neoplatonist or a New Platonist in modern scholarship. Now, among his extant writings, there are commentaries on Plato's Phaedo. That's the dialogue in which Socrates argues for the immortality of the soul in the last hours before his execution. Commenting on the dialogue, Damascius describes in summary the descent of the soul into matter and how the soul may overcome bodily death to return to its proper state of immaterial life, which processes he then summarizes in mythic terms. So here's what Damascius says, slide number 1. First, the soul must constitute an image of herself in the body. That is what animating the body means. Secondly, she must be in sympathy with her phantom because of the likeness, since every form is drawn towards its replica as a result of its innate concentration upon itself. Thirdly, having entered into the divided body, she must be torn asunder with it and end in utter disintegration, until through a life of purification she gathers herself from her dispersed state, unties the bonds of sympathy, and actualizes the primal life within her that exists by itself without the phantom. The myth describes the same events as taking place in the prototype of the soul. When Dionysus had projected his reflection into the mirror, he followed it and was thus scattered over the universe. Apollo gathers him and brings him back into heaven, for he is the purifying god and truly the savior of Dionysus, and therefore he's celebrated as the Dionysus giver. Like Kore, the soul descends into Genesis. Like Dionysus, she's scattered by generation. Like Prometheus and the Titans, she's chained to the body. She frees herself by acquiring the strength of Heracles, gathers herself together through the help of Apollo and of Athenia the savior, i.e. by truly purifying philosophy, and she elevates herself to the causes of her being with Demeter. So there's much that could be said to explain the thought behind this summary, and Damascius himself proceeds to elaborate several aspects of it. Here, though, I'd like to focus initially on just one part of the mythic summary of the soul's ascent, with a question. Why does Damascius give any role to Heracles here? The answer may seem obvious. Damascius likens the embodied soul to the bound Prometheus. By most accounts, it's Heracles who's said to deliver Prometheus from his bonds, and therefore the strength necessary for the soul to overcome its bodily bondage is likened to the famous strength of Heracles, which sets Prometheus free. Yet I think this is only the beginning of Damascius's reasons for mentioning Heracles here, for the figure of Heracles has a deeper significance to Platonic philosophy, beginning with Plato himself and continuing in the work of other Platonists until Damascius. Since this is a vast topic, I'll only be able to present a few aspects of it here today. I'll begin by briefly reviewing some of the traditional poetic background, the background pertinent to Plato's Heracles. We'll then consider at a greater length some of the references made to Heracles in Plato's dialogues, including the Phaedo, in order to develop a basic picture of Plato's Heracles. Finally, we'll return to Damascius' much later presentation of Heracles in the Phaedo commentary, in order to consider what may be particularly Platonic about Damascius's mention of Heracles. So archaic Greek poetry plays an important role in the development of the mythology of Heracles in general, and this helps to explain how Heracles grew to become a significant figure in Greek philosophy in particular. For instance, the word arete appears regularly in the archaic epic of very approximately the 7th century BCE, where the term arete refers to excellence in a certain field. In the Iliad, the term routinely refers to the competitive excellence of a warrior in combat, and on occasion it also refers to the athletic excellence of humans and horses competing in a race. In the Odyssey, arete appears similarly, but its meaning is also expanded to include Penelope's qualities of beauty, cleverness, and fidelity to Odysseus, her husband. In all cases is arete something divine, for the gods are said to exceed humans in arete, and it appears as the prerogative of Zeus in particular to grant arete to those whom he wills. Epic arete also appears in a passage from Hesiod's Works and Days, which runs as follows. Baseness is easily grasped and in abundance. Smooth is the road and it lies very near at hand. But before arete, or excellence, the immortal gods placed sweat. Long and steep is the path to that, and rough at first. But when one comes to the summit, then it becomes quite easy, however difficult it was. Hesiodic arete is thus something which mortals may strive for by their hard work. Implicitly, it's the divine reward for such work, transforming the one who obtains it. Its contrast is to be found in baseness, which is as easily obtained as it is worthless. Now, as Emma West and others have argued, we should bear in mind that Hesiod's arete refers here to the wealth and status earned by agricultural work primarily. However, we'll see shortly how adaptable Hesiod's moralizing language of work and arete would prove to be, including in their relation to Heracles. Hesiod's image of the hard road to arete is later developed by Pindar in the early 5th century, connecting it to other forms of excellence and making its significance to Heracles explicit for the first time in extant Greek verse. In general, Pindaric excellence is the achieved quality of the victorious aristocratic athletes commemorated in his odes, and he terms this areta in his dialect. At times he uses the image of the road traveled by those who honor arete, as in his 6th Olympian. So his 6th Olympian, where he says that, quote, those esteeming arete travel along a conspicuous road. He speaks often of the great toil involved in seeking arete, as in his 5th Olympian, where he says that always to toil and expense strive for arete toward an accomplishment hidden in danger. In both cases, I think Pindar's language may bring to mind Hesiod's image of the hard road to arete, implicitly placing the athletic victor on the summit of that road. While Pindar most regularly speaks of arete as a kind of aristocratic athletic prowess, he occasionally uses the term in other ways as well. And it's noteworthy that one of the oldest extant references to arete in the sense of the 4 virtues appears to be found in Pindar's 3rd Nemean, where he says that our mortal life drives a team for arete, and it bids us heed what is at hand. As for Heracles, in Pindar's odes he provides a key model of heroic arete, and as such, a standard of excellence by which one might be evaluated and to which one might aspire. For instance, in his 1st Nemean, Pindar says that I gladly cling to Heracles on the great summits of arete. A favorite Pindaric image is that of the pillars of Heracles as the absolute limit of human achievement. And Pindar may say of a victor that he has reached the limits through his arete and grasped the pillars of Heracles, as he says of Theron in the 3rd Olympian. Many such examples could be provided, and as Pindar himself says in the 6th Isthmian, it would take me too long to recount all the arete of Heracles. In any case, we should observe that Pindar is able to bring together Homeric and Hesiodic concepts of arete. Pindar's arete is highly aristocratic and competitive as in the Iliad, but his imagery of toil, roads, and summits brings to mind the path of arete from the Works and Days. Pindar is therefore important for bringing the figure of Heracles into dialogue with Homeric and Hesiodic concepts of arete, concepts which the Pindaric Heracles is able to exemplify to Pindar's hearers. It's in his capacity as a model achiever of arete that we may begin to speak of Heracles in a philosophical and even specifically Socratic context. It's Socrates' student Xenophon who provides a key witness in his Memorabilia, written in the early 4th century. In the 2nd book of the Memorabilia, we find Socrates trying to persuade his student Aristippus of the need to make an effort to control his desires. That's against Aristippus' preference for a life of pleasure and ease. Near the end of his argument, Socrates quotes the verses of Hesiod's Works and Days, which we've just seen, concerning the necessity of hard work on the path to arete. Plato, incidentally, quotes the same verses in his own writings, as in Book 4 of the Laws, where the Athenian cites them with approval when mentioning how few are those who strive for arete. It's tempting to suppose that Socrates was keen on these lines, since Xenophon presents him as reciting them to a student, and since Socrates' students Plato and Xenophon did both make use of them in their writings. As regards Heracles, this would be all the more significant in light of how Xenophon's Socrates proceeds in his exhortation to Aristippus. For after quoting Hesiod, he retells a story told by Prodicus, the story of what's called the choice of Heracles between arete and kakia, or baseness. This is a very long speech, and I've discussed it elsewhere, but in brief, it presents the young Heracles confronted by the very personifications of arete and kakia in the form of two women, each urging him to take her path in life. I should also note here that our main other evidence for the existence of such a speech by Prodicus on Heracles comes from Plato's Symposium, where it's mentioned that Prodicus was famous for writing in praise of Heracles. Again, this could indicate that Socrates really did put such a speech to his own pedagogical use, since his students Plato and Xenophon both mention it, though since they both say it was also a famous speech, it's possible their familiarity with it came from elsewhere. In any case, here I'll quote just the opening of the speech as it's related by Xenophon's Socrates, as follows. When Heracles was passing from boyhood to youth's estate, wherein the young, now becoming their own masters, show whether they'll approach life by the path of arete or the path of kakia, he went out into a quiet place and sat wondering which road to take. And there appeared to him two women of great stature making towards him. The one was fair to see and of high bearing. Her limbs were adorned with purity, her eyes with modesty, sober was her figure, and her robe was white. The other was plump and soft with high feeding. Her face was made up to heighten its natural white and pink, her figure to exaggerate her height. Open-eyed was she and dressed so as to disclose all her charms. Now she eyed herself, anon looked whether any noticed her, and often stole a glance at her own shadow. These two women are, of course, arete and kakia themselves, who each proceed to make their case to Heracles. And though Socrates doesn't indicate what happens next, we may assume that Heracles chooses the arete with which his name would become so associated in Greek poetry. Without concerning ourselves here with some other possible antecedents to Prodicus' speech, we should note the use of Heracles as a moral model of arete within a Socratic philosophical context. As we'll see when we turn in a moment to Plato, Heracles' association with arete likely informs Plato's Heracles as well, and so this may reflect Plato's Socratic background. However, we'll also see that Plato's Heracles is developed in other ways. Thus, we may begin with a fairly light-hearted passage from Plato's Theaetetus. There, Theodorus complains to Socrates that, quote, "You seem to be playing the part of Antaeus. You don't let any comer go till you've stripped him and made him wrestle with you in argument." And to this, Socrates answers as follows. "That, Theodorus, is an excellent simile to describe what is the matter with me. But I am more of a fiend for exercise than Sciron and Antaeus. I've met with many and many a Heracles and Theseus in my time, mighty men of words, and they've well battered me. But for all that I don't retire from the field, so terrible a lust has come upon me for these exercises. You must not grudge me this either. Try a fall with me, and we'll both be the better." In this case, a philosophical argument is likened to wrestling. Theodorus compares Socrates to the villainous Antaeus, who forced passing travelers to wrestle with him to the death, until Antaeus was finally defeated fatally by Heracles. The poster for my talk today shows an image of their battle, by the way. That was Heracles lifting Antaeus off the ground. Socrates enthusiastically accepts this comparison to Antaeus, modifying it humorously in the form of an irrepressible Antaeus endlessly beaten by many and many a Heracles, as he says. He likewise follows Theodorus' lead in comparing himself to Scaron, a similar villain defeated by Athens' own hero Theseus. Socrates thus employs Theodorus' heroic imagery to somewhat self-deprecating effect. It remains that here Plato has chosen to compare the struggle of philosophical argument with Heraclean labor. In order to better consider the implications of this likeness, we may turn to a similar passage from Plato's Euthydemus. In this dialogue, Socrates is engaged in a verbal battle with the titular Euthydemus and his brother Dionysodorus, who've both come recently to Athens and presented themselves there as sophists able to teach arete. At one point in their argument, Socrates is able to briefly outwit the clever Dionysodorus, and the two brothers find themselves arguing uncharacteristically against each other. But Dionysodorus rallies with a question about another matter, and when Socrates tries to ignore the new question in order to keep their attention on the previous argument, Dionysodorus accuses Socrates of running away and being unwilling to answer his question. To this, Socrates responds as follows: "And with good reason I'm running away, because I'm weaker than either of you, so that I do not hesitate to run away from you both together. I am much more worthless than Heracles, who was unable to fight it out with both the Hydra, a kind of lady sophist who was so clever that if anyone cut off one of her heads of argument, she put forth many more in its place, and with another sort of sophist, a crab arrived on shore from the sea, rather recently, I think. And when Heracles was in distress because this creature was chattering and biting on his left, he called for his nephew Iolaus to come and help him, which Iolaus successfully did. But if my Iolaus should come, he'd do more harm than good." Here Socrates likens Dionysodorus and Euthydemus to the famous Hydra and crab, monsters fought by Heracles during his labors, and both of which are portrayed in turn as being sophists like Dionysodorus and Euthydemus. Confronting these two monsters of sophistic argument, not even the mighty Heracles could endure without the help of his nephew Iolaus. Not even Heracles against two, as a proverb of the time went. But Socrates finds himself at a greater disadvantage against his two human adversaries, for not only is he weaker than Heracles, but he also places quite a bit less confidence in his absent nephew. So by the end of their discussion, Socrates finds himself at an unusual loss for words. For all the humor of this episode, we should observe that here Plato compares Socrates to Heracles, and that the labor of this Socratic Heracles clearly consists of dialectic, an argument composed of questions and answers. We should also recall the context of the argument, namely the claim of the brothers Euthydemus and Dionysodorus to teach arete. We've seen that arete is significant to Heracles, a quality he may exemplify in Greek poetry and Socratic philosophy, and certainly by Xenophon's presentation of both. Now we may add that arete could be significant to Plato's interpretation of Heracles as a symbol of the philosophical life, a life defined to Plato by the labor of dialectic. And if so, the quasi-Heraclean Socrates of the Euthydemus, maybe even that of Theaetetus, would be more than simply a Platonic joke. It happens that a very similar image of the Heraclean Socrates is found in a much more serious context in Plato's Phaedo. Here we find Socrates in the final hours before his execution, making his case for the immortality of the soul to a gathering of his friends. Early in the dialogue, he frames his argument to them as follows: I want to make my argument before you, my judges, as to why I think that a man who has truly spent his life in philosophy is probably right to be of good cheer in the face of death, and to be very hopeful that after death he'll obtain the greatest blessings yonder. I'll try to tell you, Simmias and Cabes, how this may be so. I'm afraid that other people do not realize that the one aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice for death and dying. Socrates presents his arguments in the subsequent discussion with Simmias and Cabes, to the satisfaction of most present. However, Simmias and Cabes themselves aren't persuaded, and with some reluctance owing to the circumstances of Socrates' impending execution, they each present their objections in the form of arguments for the mortality of the soul. Moved by the force of these arguments, the group become demoralized and perplexed, unable for the moment to continue the discussion. Phaedo presents what happens next as follows. Sorry for the small text here. So Phaedo says, I've certainly often admired Socrates, Echecrates, but never more than on this occasion. That he had a reply was perhaps not strange. What I wondered at most in him was the pleasant, kind, and admiring way he received the young men's arguments, and how sharply he was aware of the effect the discussion had on us. And then how well he healed our distress and, as it were, recalled us from our flight and defeat, and turned us around to join him in the examination of their argument. Echecrates says, how did he do this? Phaedo continues, I'll tell you. I happened to be sitting on his right by the couch on a low stool, so that he was sitting well above me. He stroked my head and pressed the hair on the back of my neck, for he was in the habit of playing with my hair at times. Tomorrow, Phaedo, he said, you'll probably cut this beautiful hair in mourning, Likely enough, Socrates, I said. Not if you take my advice, he said. Why not, said I. It is today, he said, that I shall cut my hair and you yours if our argument dies on us, and we cannot revive it. If I were you, and the argument escaped me, I'd take an oath as the Argives did, not to let my hair grow before I fought again and defeated the argument of Simmias and Cebes. But, I said, they say that not even Heracles could fight two people. Then call on me as your Iolaus as long as the daylight lasts. I shall call on you, but in this case as Iolaus calling on Heracles. It makes no difference, he said, and from there Socrates carries forward their discussion. Thus Phaedo implicitly compares the task of confronting the arguments of both Simmias and Cebes to Heracles' confrontation of the Hydra and the crab, a confrontation which not even Heracles could defeat without the help of Iolaus. Just like Socrates in the Euthydemus, Phaedo invokes this image to suggest the impossibility of his arguing successfully against two people. But unlike Socrates in the Euthydemus, Phaedo has a capable Iolaus in the form of Socrates, ready to come to his aid, as Socrates himself indicates. Phaedo accepts this development of his Heraclean metaphor, only he now rejects the comparison of himself to Heracles, which has become explicit in it. Phaedo will be the Iolaus to the Heracles of Socrates, even if it means that this Iolaus must call upon Heracles. To Socrates, it makes no difference whether he'll be Heracles or Iolaus, and in any case, he proves quite capable of carrying forward the argument by himself against Simmias and Cebes. While we thus see a qualified comparison of Socrates to Heracles, we may also see more clearly now than in the Euthydemus that the task of philosophical argument is likened to a labor of Heracles. As we consider this, we must bear in mind, again, Socrates' initial remarks that, quote, the one aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice for dying and death, and that after death, the properly philosophical soul will, quote, attain the greatest blessings. Socrates' arguments to the immortality of the soul are part of the proper philosophizing that is compared to a Heraclean labor. It seems implicit that just as Heracles' life of labor ended with the achievement of blessed immortality among the gods, so too does a new life await Socrates after death, a more divine kind of life which Socrates has earned by his philosophical labors. The philosophical symbolism of the comparison of the philosophical discussion to a labor of Heracles thus goes beyond its use to proverbially exemplify the difficulty for one person of confronting two in argument, beyond even Plato's more general image of philosophical argument as a task of Heraclean difficulty. For latent in this symbolism is the death and apotheosis of Heracles, pertinent to the Socratic goal of living philosophically in preparation for death and a more divine subsequent state of being. Within a Platonic context, the figure of Heracles is thus able to serve as a symbol of philosophical immortality. Before we consider the further implications of this, we should note a further comparison in Plato's dialogues of philosophical argument to Heraclean labor. This is found in the Symposium, upon the drunken arrival of Alcibiades to the tragic poet Agathon's party in celebration of his first victory at the Dionysia. Alcibiades has come to congratulate Agathon and present him with a crown of victory. Events unfold as follows, somewhat abridged in the following slide. Agathon called Alcibiades to his side, so Alcibiades again, with the help of his friends, approached Agathon. At the same time, he kept trying to take his ribbons off so that he could crown Agathon with them, but all he succeeded in doing was to push them further down his head until they finally slipped over his eyes. What with the ivy of the crown and all, he didn't see Socrates, who had made room for him on the couch as soon as he saw him. So Alcibiades sat down between Socrates and Agathon, and as soon as he did so, he put his arms around Agathon, kissed him, and placed the ribbons on his head. Agathon asked his slaves to take Alcibiades' sandals off. "We can all three fit on my couch," he said. "What a good idea," Alcibiades replied. "But wait a moment, who's the third?" As he said this, he turned around, and it was only then that he saw Socrates. No sooner had he seen him than he leapt up and cried, "Heracles, what's going on here? It's Socrates." But for the moment, and I've skipped a little bit, but for the moment, he said, turning to Agathon, "Give me some of these ribbons. I'd better make a wreath for him as well. Look at that magnificent head. Otherwise, I know he'll make a scene. He'll be grumbling that though I crowned you for your first victory, I didn't honor him, even though he has never lost an argument in his life." So Alcibiades took the ribbons, arranged them on Socrates' head, and lay back on the couch. Heracles is named simply in Alcibiades' common Greek exclamation of surprise. Indeed, the translation I've quoted from here actually reads "good Lord" in its unmodified version, providing an equivalent English expression to the Greek exclamation of Heracles. However, here and elsewhere in the Plato's dialogues, I'd argue that the exclamation of Heracles' name may at least sometimes be more than simply incidental. Certainly in this instance, I think it's quite likely. For Alcibiades' subsequent action is to crown Socrates, who is, quote, and in a more literal translation, Socrates is victorious in words against all humans, not just once, but always. Alcibiades thus speaks of Socrates as a kind of victor among human beings, and this language of victory happens to be highly appropriate to Heracles. For instance, a well-known fragment of an early Olympic hymn to Heracles begins by praising Heracles as Kalinikos, or beautiful in victory, one of the many names by which Heracles was worshipped as a god. Another early poetry similarly praises Heracles as undefeated. The ancient Olympics themselves were regularly said to have been founded by Heracles, who was also said to have provided Olympia with the olive trees from which were made the crowns given as prizes to victorious athletes. Given such Heraclean associations with victory and the crowning of victors, I think it's quite fitting that it's Heracles' name which Alcibiades exclaims upon seeing Socrates. If so, then we should also observe that Socrates' victory is in the words of his philosophical arguments. As we've seen in the Phaedo, Euthydemus, and Theaetetus, philosophical argument may be likened by Plato to a kind of Heraclean activity. Here too we may see such an occasion, with successful philosophical argument likened to a kind of Heraclean victoriousness. At the risk of straining my argument, I'd also like to note that the particular philosophical argument Socrates makes immediately before the arrival of Alcibiades concerns the ascent towards the beautiful itself, as described to him, he says, by Diotima. He concludes his account of her speech to him as follows. Do you think it would be a poor life for a human being to look there and behold it by that which he ought, and to be with it? Or haven't you remembered, she said, that in that life alone, when he looks at beauty in the only way that beauty can be seen, only then will it become possible for him to give birth not to images of arete, because he's in touch with no images, but to true arete, because he's in touch with the true beauty. The love of the gods belongs to anyone who's given birth to true arete and nourished it. And if any human being could become immortal, it would be he. Diotima's remarks thus concern a number of themes which we've seen to have Heraclean associations elsewhere in Plato's dialogues. The mention of becoming immortal through the apprehension of the forms resonates with the Phaedo, where Socrates discusses the forms in his argument for the immortality of the soul, the argument he makes in response to the earlier objections of Cineas and Cebes. This, as we've seen, is the very argument in which Phaedo compares Socrates to Heracles. Moreover, we've seen in the Symposium that the apprehension of the form of beauty is the source of true arete. By now, we've seen that arete is a term with potential Heraclean associations, both in general and specifically within a Socratic context. It's within this context in the Symposium that Alcibiades arrives, exclaims Heracles upon seeing Socrates, and crowns him for his dialectical victories. Thus, the name of Heracles may serve here to help connect, on the one hand, the themes of arete, immortality, and the ascent to beauty in Diotima's speech to Socrates, and it connects these with the image of the philosophical life as one characterized by the labor of argument. So the examples I've gone through here are just the start of my study of Heraclean language in Plato. There are numerous further instances of such language, and in some of these, Heracles might simply be mentioned in passing, and others are more complex. As a brief example of what I mean by the latter, the complex ones, some modern commentators have drawn attention to the significance of the first word of the Republic, in which Socrates says, "I went down," or kateben in Greek. It's been argued that this may bring to mind the mythological motif of the katabasis, the descent of a hero into Hades, most famously the descent of Heracles in order to fetch Cerberus. The word may also bring to mind the Republic's allegory of the cave, in which the philosopher who's seen the good must go back down into the cave to help others. By this account, Socrates would be cast in both roles, going back down into the cave as a philosopher in a way that would bring to mind Heracles' most difficult labor, one in which he successfully confronts a creature which enforces human mortality and makes his ascent, prefiguring his own apotheosis. Such imagery would again liken Socrates to Heracles, and it would again make Heracles a symbol of philosophical immortality within a Platonic context. By way of a conclusion, though, let's return to the passage from Damascius's Phaedo commentary that I started with. As we do so, let's bear in mind that in moving directly from Plato to Damascius, we've moved abruptly forward in time by some 900 years or so to the early 6th century of our era. My purpose here is not to ignore the implications of those many intervening centuries. What I mean rather is simply to begin to take stock of the temporal boundaries for the study of Heracles and Platonic philosophy. So we've seen that Damascius's mention of Heracles comes in his mythic summary of the ascent of the soul from embodiment, wherein it's Heracles' strength that frees Prometheus from his bonds. Now Damascius continues as follows, commenting on Socrates' remark in the Phaedo that, quote, "It's only those who practice philosophy in the right way who always most want to free the soul." And this is what Damascius says. So quoting the Phaedo, "Only to those who practice philosophy in the right way, that is to say steadfastly, in a spirit of purification." Quoting the Phaedo, "Their own deliverance is a matter of intense and incessant care. The care, or prometeia, coming to them from Prometheus, the constancy and intensity from Heracles. For it is to unceasing endeavor that the effort of liberation owes its strength." Here Damascius elaborates on the Heraclean qualities by which philosophers may be purified of their bonds to the body, namely the incessance and intensity which produce the strength of their efforts. To be sure, such incessance and intensity would seem to be broadly characteristic of Heracles in myth. However, we can see now it's within a Platonic context that such an incessance and intensity refer at least in part to the practice of dialectic, Socrates' Heraclean labor in the Phaedo and elsewhere. That such a practice may be part of the philosopher's effort to ascend to a higher state of being after death is an implication of this Heraclean imagery, both in Damascius's commentary and in the Phaedo itself. The philosophical life is thus interpreted in Heraclean terms as exemplified by the figure of Socrates, whose own life and death may therefore be understood as a struggle along the divine path to arete towards a philosophical kind of immortality. So, thank you. I'll turn my video back on and stop the screen share.
That's great. Thanks so much, Warren, for this this great talk on a kind of, I was thinking it's wide ranging. It's hard to sort of summarize, but you know, the kind of reception almost, if you will, of arete and excellence from within Plato, and looking back at these rich texts. I know one of which at least is really dear to my scholarly heart, anyways, Pindar. But the kind of way that this term that's so malleable and has such a wide semantic range is then used by Plato to represent something which for him is new, I guess. So I'm sure some of our audience members will have questions, but I am also just as sure that it's some few moments to sort of work through what they're thinking and come up with some thoughts. So I do have a sort of broad question, which I hate to be the kind of person who's going to ask you to talk a bit about something you didn't mention, as it were, but that's sort of your typical scholarly question, I guess. But I was struck, you know, like throughout your talk that you're really sort of talking about a kind of physicality to philosophical work by its comparison to Heracles' labor, and then the implicit comparison to, say, the work of the athlete or the work of the warrior. So the philosopher can also be an athlete or warrior, in a sense, I guess. And it made me think of, you know, the sort of famous example of Socrates in the Apology when he says, "You should treat me like an Olympic victor because I'm just as good for the city." So I just wondered if, you know, beyond these explicit references to Heracles, if you have any more to say about, you know, how Plato might represent philosophical work as a kind of, as physical work, as opposed to our own, I guess, modern distinction between the sort of mental and the physical. How does Plato sort of connect these two, if you have some thoughts on that?
That's a good question. Just as you speak here, I'm going to make some notes because these are things for me to consider as I expand this research. I've not actually been looking too much yet at what he says about non-Heraclean physicality. I can say, from the examples I talked about today, he extended to other heroic points of comparison, but I don't have too much to say right now about how he'd compare it to other gods and heroes. Perhaps something that does strike me if we, there's a lot I didn't talk about today between Plato and Damascius. Among some of the other Platonic philosophers who talk about Heracles, there's Plotinus. And Plotinus talks about what he says of Heracles in the first of the Enneads. He talks about how appropriate Homer's image of Heracles is to have the shade in the underworld and then Heracles himself on Olympus. And he says that's because Heracles was really, in a sense, torn. There was this part of him that was cultivating virtues and deserves to be among the gods, but there's also this way in which he calls it a man of action, I think, and he has lower concerns and can't escape the bounds of mortality, and that Heracles ends up in the underworld. It's making me think of your question about the physicality of the philosopher. At least with the image of Heracles, Plotinus seems to have a certain discomfort with that.
Oh, that's a great comparison. Yeah. In fact, I see a question and answer that is indeed following on from this, from our colleague here, Dr. Funky, thinking about, and it's true that there are so many different Heracleses in the ancient world that are at play. So she asks, how does the comic use of Heracles on stage inform your argument about these appearances in philosophy?
Another good question. I've not been looking too much into comedy yet. That's another one of the next steps I have to take this in. It does come up sometimes. So for instance, in Xenophon's discussion there of the choice of Heracles, I actually skipped over a little bit between his presentation of the works and days and those paths of virtue, and then the description of the road and the choice of Heracles between Arete and Kakia. He quotes a couple of verses of Epicharmos, so a bit of comic poetry. And Epicharmos was famous for writing about the marriage of Heracles. His comedy with the marriage of Heracles survives in, as I recall, fragments where we have this long, bewildering variety of edible sea creatures named. It's all stuff that he's presumably eating at the wedding feast. And it's that Heraclean excess which is being emphasized. Xenophon didn't refer to that explicitly. He was quoting more of a moralizing maxim from Epicharmos. But maybe it brings to mind that there are some very different ways of portraying Heracles, ways in which he doesn't embody that kind of moralizing arete that the philosophers are keen on. And within the context of the Memorabilia, maybe that shows us that if Heracles doesn't, we know how Heracles will choose, but what's Aristippus going to do? And of course, he's going to go on to found his own hedonistic school of philosophy. So maybe Aristippus will interpret Heracles a little differently and prefer that comic image of him.
It's interesting. You're right that Heracles not only has within different or outside, but between their authors, has different versions of him appear. But even within them, and I'm thinking of I can't remember which ode it is of Pindar's, but that Heracles is imagined fighting against Apollo and Hades, and Pindar says it's one of his Brooks formels, where he says, "Oh, I'm gonna stop. I don't want to talk bad about Heracles," but there is this imagined instance, even in Pindar, who, as you rightly say, is Heracles is so great, but even then he can find that he can't ignore completely the excess that seems to be attached to Heracles in almost all of his incarnations in the ancient world. Even physically, I'm thinking of the Farnese Heracles, right? One of the most athletic statues, but a kind of body type that's antithetical to most of the ways that athletes are represented.
Yeah, it brings up a difficulty in Homer's presentation too. I mentioned that Homer never really explicitly talks about the arete of Heracles. Implicitly, we could argue it was there because of the way Heracles really stands as a model for the warriors. And the warriors are said to embody arete, so presumably Heracles does too. It just never comes right out and says that. But we have other cases in both the Odyssey and the Iliad, where, for instance, in the Odyssey, Heracles' killing of his guest Iphictus is mentioned. He kills Iphictus just to take his nice horses. He's hardly embodying virtue there. So there is that tension in his figure as well. he's a versatile enough character that the philosophers can emphasize certain aspects of their portrayal for him, but lots of different things can be done with him.
I don't want to monopolize the questions, so please add your questions to the Q&A, or if you want to use the chat function to add something. Oh, as I spoke, someone's done so. I didn't know I could command it so easily. So our next question is from our colleague here, Dr. Pauline Rapat, and she asks the following. Was Heracles considered a healing deity in the Greek world, as Hercules appears to have been in the Roman world? And if so, do you think that the philosophical presentation of Heracles depends upon his recognition as such? Put otherwise, does the philosophical use of Heracles depend to some extent upon the pragmatic associations of Heracles with the mediator of physical health and sickness?
Thank you for that question. That's very interesting. And I've not been thinking too much of Heracles' role as a healing deity here and how it might bear upon his philosophical implications. It certainly looks, now that you ask about it, it looks like it would be relevant because, say in that passage from the Phaedo I quoted earlier, he even talks about how Socrates healed us from our distress. There was some healing and medical imagery there. So I'll have to look more into that. I'm just thinking more broadly of Heracles's aspects as a healing divinity in Greece. I know that he is a little after this period, so I don't know if he was a healing divinity, say, in the classical period. A little later, there's all that evidence of, say, the magical amulets, and some of those are Greek or have Greek text on them, so that's suggesting a healing Heracles in a Greek context. I don't know how far back that goes.
Other questions for Dr. Huard? I'll pause just a moment to let anyone else speak before I ask my next question. Okay, well, that was a moment, so I'm gonna indulge myself then as the host here, one of the hosts here. So, Warren, you also mentioned about this idea. I think I'm correct in summarizing you here that the sort of pursuit of arete can be by the philosopher can be a way of attaining a kind of immortality, like the pursuit of arete through the labors was a way of attaining immortality for Heracles. I was thinking also about other images to do this. I wondered if they appear. So I'm really asking again a kind of like way out there question perhaps, but I'm thinking about the image of like fire as a way of as a transcendent sort of action. So, I'm thinking of the end of the Trachiniae where Heracles goes off to set his own funeral pyre and I guess burns away, I think that's how it's supposed to be, burns away his body somehow and then emerges into Olympus. So I just wondered if that image of like fire as a purification or a way to retain immortality is kind of tied to arete and its connection with immortality in Plato. It's a big, I'd have no idea. It's a totally ignorant question.
Thanks for the question again. Unfortunately, I can't say much about this one. I've not looked much at fire in this context. I know, certainly besides the Trachiniae, there are other instances of Heracles' myth and ritual where fire has that relevance to his apotheosis. So it'll be another thing to look into. I guess that's all I can say.
No, that's fair. And of course, when you're sort of in these sort of beginnings of a research project, and you give a talk, it's always courageous because you get people who like asking these completely absurd questions, and then, but hopefully, I'll pause again in case someone else wants to jump in. Well, maybe I'll ask one final question, and again, it's a broad one, so feel free to address it however you want. But I am also always struck in Pindar by the sort of path of arete and the road of virtue, whatever. And this obviously still is a sort of way used today to describe sort of journeys through life, or the metaphor of the road as a way to get through life. So I wondered if there's more to say about this. At least again, I'm speaking from ignorance in the corpus of Plato, about how the sort of road, the metaphor of the road and the journey as a way to get, I can't say it without using the metaphor, as a way to get through life, is deployed, and how this connects to arete, but also just more generally how this metaphor is sort of taken by Plato or reinvigorated by him, if it is.
Another good question. Here so far I've only been looking at this road when it has to do with Heracles, or more broadly that passage from Hesiod that I mentioned. So there are a couple places in Plato where he's citing those verses of Hesiod, or probably alluding to them, and there it's that specific image from Hesiod of the road to Arete. I don't know about other cases of the road. I mean, I talked about Socrates, I guess, on the road into the Piraeus in the Republic, but they've not been looking too much at those road images yet. There are certainly other poetic precedents between Hesiod's road and Xenophon's story of the choice of Heracles. There are some other accounts which probably influenced it. I think it's Simonides, who describes a steep uphill path which leads to Arete, and it's a personification of Arete. His version doesn't have Heracles in it, and I don't think he describes any choice of roads, but it's this high road to Arete, and it's another poetic case which probably influenced that language, something Pindar might be building on.
It's always so difficult with these authors when you have the sort of missing link that you don't necessarily have access to. Our friend from Winnipeg here, Dr. Kevin Walby, posts a question in the chat. Is Heracles linked to any mystery cults or sacred mysteries in Greek antiquity? And if so, how?
Well, that's a huge question. The very short answer is yes. So for starters, he's linked to the Eleusinian mysteries. So if we divide the Eleusinian mysteries into kind of the main Eleusinian mysteries and then the preparatory lesser mysteries, Heracles plays the role of the kind of model initiant. We have many vases which depict Heracles being initiated at the lesser mysteries in preparation for his descent to go to the underworld. And it's yet another case where Heracles is serving the role of this kind of exemplary figure. I've talked about him here a bit as an exemplary philosopher. In Pindar, you're looking at him as the exemplary athlete. I mentioned Homer, the exemplary warrior. And he's arguably the exemplary Eleusinian initiate in some ways in some of these pottery sources. Besides there are various other Eleusinian associations. And one of the things, again, in the background of my project here is the relation Heracles might have to Bacchic mysteries and Dionysus. And without going too much into that, again, I think there is some connection. And it might be related to the fact that we have so many vases which show Heracles and Dionysus together, like the silly one I showed you at the end of the slides, but also there are just many others which show Dionysus and Heracles often just paired. It might be at a drinking party, it might be in some other circumstance. Sometimes it's at the apotheosis of Heracles, and there's Dionysus looking almost like a kind of patron of Heracles at his apotheosis in certain contexts. I think there is a mystic context there as well for Heracles. So yes, he has strong mystery associations, and those mystic associations of Dionysus come up overtly in the Phaedo, and of course Damascius speaks about them at great length. And I think that might be a part of what the Heracles is doing there as well. It might have to do with those mystic associations to Dionysus and mysteries more broadly.
Well, maybe if there are no further questions, we can call things to an end here. Warren, I should say, at least for my money, my questions come, as I said, from ignorance and from the fact that I found so much of what you said today so convincing. As just a simple note, I thought, as an example of an insight that can be brought from the close reading of text, your reading of the Hercules interjection or exclamation in the Symposium seems to me to be one of those things that once it's explained seems so obvious it has to be right. And so I think that's an example of what clearly are the insights that your project is going to bring as you continue to work on it. So thanks for sharing some of this initial research with us today, and we'll obviously be looking forward to seeing the fruits of it in publications, and maybe even in a future New Directions talk update edition in the future. Before I let our audience members go, I'll just remind you that our series is over for the fall, but in about 2 months' time, we'll return to have both live stream and fingers crossed, it's not necessarily trending the right way in Winnipeg, but we'll see, in-person lectures on the University of Winnipeg campus. If you're listening and you're from Winnipeg, these lectures will only be open to members of the University of Winnipeg community and those who are fully vaccinated, i.e. those who have the green sticker on their faculty, staff, or student ID card. If you're not from Winnipeg or won't be able to attend campus because you don't have that, you'll still be able to watch them via live streams and find the link in the normal places: Twitter, Instagram, other social media, and by emailing me at pj.miller@uwinnipeg.ca. Our series will start up again January 20th and 21st with back-to-back talks by Dr. Alexander Meyer and Dr. Elizabeth Green from the University of Western Ontario, both of whom will be talking about new research at the military community of Vindolanda in Northern Britain. We'll have our own Dr. Melanie Rissette Campbell give a talk on February 4th on walking through and around Rome, a new project on the space of the city of Rome. And then we'll end our series this year on March 17th and 18th with back-to-back talks by Dr. Max Goldman and Dr. Rebecca Kennedy. Dr. Goldman on new research on the Eurysakes monument in Rome, and Dr. Kennedy with a talk sponsored by the Society for Classical Studies called Classics, Indigeneity, and Modern Scientific Race. Her talk will take place at the University of Winnipeg's Merchants Corner North End campus. With that, it just leaves me to thank Dr. Huard for closing our series for the fall with this insightful talk about arete, the physical work of intellectual pursuits, an appropriate thing to talk about when it's getting into exam time, and it's certainly major essay time. I'm sure students can sympathize with the fact that intellectual labor is indeed physical labor, and the professors who mark their papers certainly can feel the same way. So with that, I'll thank Dr. Huard on behalf of myself and the Department of Classics and my co-organizer, Ruth Dickinson, and to our audience members as well. Thanks for joining in. Again, if you want to revisit this talk or want to share it with anyone who you think may have liked it, please email me if you want to get the link. Usually I have the talk up on our YouTube channel on Monday afternoon. So I'll wish you all a happy weekend. And if you're here in Winnipeg, enjoy and have a safe drive home if you're moving anywhere in the city right now. Thanks very much again, Warren. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.